What if I told you that one simple mistake could turn a cop's life upside down? Officer Greg Matthews didn't know that the decision he made at that traffic stop would be the beginning of a nightmare. As the evening sun faded into the horizon, he pulled over a car in a quiet neighborhood, a routine stop, or so he thought. Tanya Williams, a single mother, was simply trying to get home after a long day at work. A quick exchange of words, a flash of tension in the air, and then chaos. Tanya was just another black woman in a world that often overlooked her, just another driver in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what Officer Matthews didn't know was that Tanya wasn't a woman to be underestimated. She wasn't going to let this pass without making sure her voice was heard. As Matthews approached her car, his hand instinctively hovered near his gun, the unnecessary tension thickening with every passing second. Tanya, who had learned early in life to keep her cool, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, trying her best not to provoke him. She could feel the sharpness of his gaze, the weight of his judgment pressing down on her. But Tanya was no stranger to this. She'd faced discrimination before, from people who judged her based on her skin color and her job as a cashier at a local store. She was used to being treated like she didn't matter. But not today. As Matthews leaned in, Tanya's eyes met his, calm but firm. "I'm just trying to get home," she said, her voice steady. Matthews, clearly irritated by her composed demeanor, started to shout orders, demanding her ID. His voice rose in anger as he pointed out some minor infraction, one that Tanya knew didn't even exist. She could feel her frustration building, but she kept her cool. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice firm, but Matthews, blinded by his sense of power, only saw defiance. His hand moved closer to his holster. Tanya knew she had to act fast. "You don't need to do this," she warned him. But Matthews wasn't listening. His anger flared, and before Tanya knew it, he pulled his gun out, aiming it at her. Tanya's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger. The moment she saw Matthews raise his weapon, she sent a quick text to her old friend, a Navy SEAL, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. She knew she had to make sure someone would have her back. "It's done," she typed, her fingers shaking but determined. The message was short, but the meaning was clear. Tanya was done playing the game by the rules set by people like Officer Matthews. No longer the invisible woman, no longer the one who could be dismissed, she had reached out to the only people who could make a difference. And the next morning, Tanya's life would change forever. Matthews woke up to the unsettling sound of a knock on his door. When he opened it, he was met with the sight of 30 Navy SEALs, standing in formation, their presence an overwhelming force of power and authority. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthews had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but he knew it couldn't be good. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The SEALs had come for him, for his actions. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about power and control crumbled. The next few hours would feel like a blur. Matthews would learn that the tables had turned, and the truth was about to be revealed in a way that he would never have imagined. Tanya's quiet strength had set something in motion, something that would forever alter the course of both their lives. As the SEALs surrounded his house, Matthews realized he had underestimated the power of a woman who refused to be silenced. The morning sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow across the city. Tanya Williams lay in her hospital bed, the dull hum of machines around her. The weight of what had happened the night before was still fresh, but her body was too exhausted to feel anything other than the throb of pain. Her mind kept replaying the events, the quick text she had sent to her friend from the past, the sudden, sharp tension in the air, and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had known something would happen. She didn't expect this, though. The door to her room creaked open, and a nurse entered, checking her vitals with a gentle touch. Tanya didn't flinch. She was used to people coming and going, used to the cold stares and whispers, but today was different. Today, things were shifting. Outside her room, the world was still turning. Greg Matthews, meanwhile, had not slept a wink. The events of the previous night haunted him as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He replayed Tanya's calm demeanor in his mind, the way she had looked him in the eye without fear. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had done his job, or at least he thought he had, but he hadn't anticipated what would come next. He didn't understand why he felt so rattled by a woman he had barely interacted with. He was used to being in control, used to people following orders. But Tanya had done something he couldn't explain. She had taken the power back, and now, he was the one feeling powerless. He turned over in bed and picked up his phone. The message was brief but clear. Asterisk, the SEALs are here. They know what you did. Asterisk, his fingers tightened around the phone. He stood up quickly, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. 30 Navy SEALs. 30 trained soldiers, sent by someone Tanya knew. He didn't know how she had done it, but the reality was clear. His life, his career, everything was about to change. Matthews quickly dressed and made his way to the front door, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. He opened it to find the SEALs standing in perfect formation, their stoic faces unreadable. His heart skipped a beat as one of them stepped forward. "Officer Matthews, we need to talk," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. Matthews opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The SEALs didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to command the room. Matthews finally found his voice, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. "What is this about?" he managed to say, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "You'll find out soon enough," the SEAL replied, his eyes never leaving Matthews. Matthews was escorted out of his home and into the waiting van. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat in the back, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. He had made a mistake, one that he couldn't undo. As the van sped through the streets, Matthews realized that his life, as he knew it, was over. Tanya's quiet strength, her refusal to back down, had changed everything. He had underestimated her, and now, he was going to pay the price. Meanwhile, Tanya, still recovering in the hospital, had no idea what was happening at Matthew's house. She didn't need to. She had done her part. What she didn't know was that her one act of defiance had started a chain of events that would reshape not only her life, but the lives of those who had once thought they were untouchable. And as Matthews sat in the back of the van, on his way to face the consequences of his actions, he began to understand just how wrong he had been. He had underestimated Tanya Williams, and now, he would face the truth that he had so desperately tried to avoid. As the hours passed, the weight of the situation continued to press down on Officer Greg Matthews. He sat in a small, stark room, the walls closing in around him. The SEALs had taken him from his home and placed him in this holding area, far from the world he knew. He was alone, unsure of what would come next. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder until the door creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Officer Matthews," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to answer some questions." Matthews swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but one thing was certain. He had no control over the situation anymore. "What is this about?" Matthews asked, his voice shaking. "You know exactly what this is about," the man replied. "The woman you shot, Tanya Williams. She's not just a victim. She has connections, powerful ones." Matthews felt a knot form in his stomach. He had underestimated Tanya, thinking she was just another black woman who wouldn't be able to make a difference. But now, he was learning just how wrong he was. "Who do you work for?" Matthews pressed, trying to regain some sense of control. "I'm here on behalf of people who don't like to be crossed," the man said, a cold smile playing at the corners of his lips. Matthews' mind raced as the implications of the situation sank in. Tanya wasn't just some random person. She had reached out to someone with the power to send Navy SEALs after him. The realization hit him hard. He had been part of a much bigger story than he had ever imagined. Meanwhile, Tanya was still in the hospital, recovering from the events that had unfolded the night before. Her body ached, but her mind was clear. She had no idea what was happening to Matthews, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done what she had set out to do. She had sent a message. The people who had wronged her would face the consequences. Tanya had always known she was capable of more than what the world had expected of her. For years, she had lived under the radar, invisible to most people. But not anymore. Not after what she had done. As she lay in her bed, her thoughts drifted to her son, the one person she knew she had to keep fighting for. She had done this for him, to make sure he never had to face the same kind of injustice that she had. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her friend, the Navy SEAL. "It's done. He's being held. You'll get your day in court." Tanya's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. She had never wanted violence, never wanted to see anyone hurt. But she had wanted justice. And now, it seemed like that justice was finally within reach. Back in the holding room, Matthews sat in silence, the weight of the man's words sinking in. He had never considered the possibility that Tanya could be someone with power, someone who could make people like him pay for their actions. And yet, here he was, trapped in a situation he didn't know how to escape. The door opened again, and the man in the suit stepped out, leaving Matthews alone with his thoughts. For the first time in his career, Matthews felt fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of what might come next. He had always believed he was untouchable, but now, he understood just how fragile that illusion had been. As he sat in the sterile room, he realized something he had never considered before. He was no longer in control. And the woman he had wronged, Tanya Williams, was the one who held all the cards. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty for Officer Greg Matthews. He sat in a small, windowless room, waiting for something he couldn't predict. The air felt thick, as if every breath he took was loaded with the consequences of his actions. He was no longer the man in control, the one who wore his badge with pride and believed he could always find a way out of any situation. Now, all that was left was the cold reality of his mistakes. Tanya Williams, on the other hand, felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. As she sat in the hospital bed, her body still aching from the confrontation, her mind was clear. She had done what she set out to do. She had sent a message, not just to Officer Matthews, but to the world. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her phone buzzed again, a message from her Navy SEAL friend. "They're moving him. They'll make sure he answers for everything." Tanya smiled, her heart lifting a little at the thought of Matthews facing the repercussions of his actions. But even then, it wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the people who had always been overlooked, the ones who were so often treated as less than human, had a voice. She had that voice now. Her phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a news alert. A story had broken, detailing the incident from the night of the traffic stop. Officer Matthews was now under investigation, and Tanya's name was all over the headlines. It was surreal, the way her life had shifted so suddenly. From a woman ignored by most, she had become a symbol of strength and resilience. It wasn't the fame she had wanted, but it was something she could use. The message was loud and clear. She wouldn't stand by and let injustice happen anymore. Meanwhile, Matthews was still in the holding room, his mind racing with questions. How had this happened? How had one simple traffic stop spiraled so far out of control? He had done his job, or at least he had thought he had. He had been trained to react in situations like that, but this was different. Tanya wasn't supposed to be someone who could fight back. She wasn't supposed to be someone who had the connections to make the world stop and take notice. Yet here he was, facing the consequences of his actions. The door to his room opened again. This time, it was the man in the dark suit who had come to speak to him. Matthews had seen him a few times already, but this time, there was something different in his eyes. "You're going to answer for what you did," the man said, his voice steady and unyielding. Matthews opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He had been part of something bigger than he could have imagined, and now he was trapped in the web of his own making. "It's not over," the man continued. "You're going to face the full consequences." Matthews nodded slowly, his head spinning. He had no choice but to accept what was coming. Back at the hospital, Tanya leaned back against her pillows, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had done what she needed to do, and now she had to let the world do its part. What came next was out of her hands. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't going to be a victim anymore. She wasn't going to stay silent while people like Officer Matthews used their power to tear others down. She was done being invisible. And as she closed her eyes, Tanya knew that the next chapter of her life was just beginning. The days following Tanya's recovery seemed to stretch on forever. The media had picked up the story, and the world was watching. Officer Greg Matthews was no longer just an officer. He was the face of a scandal that had caught the public's attention. Tanya, once an invisible woman, had now become a symbol of strength, and in the most unexpected way, justice was beginning to unfold. Tanya spent most of her time in the hospital room, but her mind was sharp and focused. The messages of support were overwhelming, but there was one message that stood out. It was from her old friend in the Navy SEALs. They're not going to stop, but neither will you. This will end soon, I promise. Tanya's eyes flicked to the window as she pondered the words. This was bigger than just her. This wasn't just about her being wronged. It was about making sure that people like her, people who had always been overlooked and ignored, would never again be silenced. Matthews, meanwhile, was in a different kind of prison. He wasn't physically confined, but his mind was. The weight of what he had done sat heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't escape it, no matter how hard he tried. For the first time in his career, he had no answers, no way to talk his way out of this. The media had painted him as the villain and Tanya as the victim, but he knew the truth was far more complicated. As the days passed, Matthews was summoned to a meeting with his superiors. He knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. He could feel the tension in the air as he sat down across from the chief of police and several other high-ranking officers. Officer Matthews, the chief began, his tone cold and serious. We've received reports about the incident. You're currently under investigation. You know the gravity of the situation. Matthews opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt tight, and he struggled to find his voice. I've been a police officer for 15 years, he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I've never had a complaint against me before. I don't know what happened that night. The chief looked at him, his expression unreadable. We don't need an explanation right now, Matthews. What we need is for you to step down while we conduct our investigation. This is bigger than your career and bigger than what happened in that moment. Matthews nodded slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. The years of pride and power he had built up were slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Tanya, on the other hand, had begun the process of moving forward. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the pain in her body felt like too much to bear. But every day, she grew stronger, her resolve harder. She had faced down the injustice she had lived with for so long, and now she was ready to face the future. She had no idea what was going to happen to Matthews or to her, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone, especially someone like Matthews, define her. As the investigation continued, more details began to emerge. The evidence was stacking up against Matthews. Tanya's message had reached the right people, and they weren't going to let her down. The pressure was mounting, and Matthews was beginning to feel it. He couldn't escape the truth of his actions, and he knew the world was watching. As the hours turned into days, the walls seemed to close in around him. He had been a part of a system that had failed, and now there was no way out. Tanya's victory wasn't just about the end of one man's career. It was about a shift in power, a shift that was long overdue. The next chapter was about to begin, and no one could stop it. As the days passed, the tension surrounding Officer Greg Matthews began to feel like a weight he couldn't shake. He was now under constant scrutiny, not only from his department, but from the public, as the investigation into his actions continued. The media was relentless, painting him as the villain, and Tanya Williams, the woman he had wronged, was now seen as the symbol of resilience and justice. Tanya had become the voice for so many people who had been silenced for far too long. She had no desire for fame, but she couldn't ignore the responsibility that came with the attention. As she recovered, she found herself becoming an unexpected leader in her community. People reached out to her, sharing their own stories of injustice, and she listened. Tanya knew that her journey wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about changing the world for the better, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Matthews had been placed on administrative leave, but it didn't feel like much of a break. Every call he received felt like another reminder of his failure. He couldn't escape the images of that night, the sound of Tanya's calm voice, the way she held her ground, and the guilt that followed. As much as he tried to push those images away, they kept coming back. He wasn't the man he thought he was. His superiors had warned him that this investigation would change everything, but he never expected it to feel so suffocating. The pressure of his actions weighed heavily on him, and he knew that no matter what happened next, his career would never be the same. Tanya's life, on the other hand, was beginning to take a new direction. The media coverage had given her a platform, but she used it with caution. She didn't want to be seen as a martyr. She just wanted to help people understand that their voices mattered. She spoke at rallies, met with local leaders, and worked behind the scenes to advocate for real change. But despite the work she was doing, she still couldn't forget the moment she saw Officer Matthews raise his weapon. It haunted her, not because of the pain it caused, but because of how it represented a system that had failed her and so many others. Matthews, still grappling with the weight of his actions, found himself alone with his thoughts one evening, sitting in his living room. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, perhaps an answer, some sign of redemption. The phone rang, interrupting his quiet contemplation. It was a call he had been dreading. The chief of police. Matthews picked up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. "Matthews," the chief said, his voice steady but stern. "We've reviewed the case, and it's not looking good for you. We've had complaints, and the evidence points to excessive force. The department is considering termination." Matthews' heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. "I understand," he said, his voice hollow. "I know I've failed." The chief didn't respond immediately. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "This isn't just about you, Matthews. This is about the integrity of the department. We can't have officers who abuse their power. You've damaged the trust that we've worked so hard to build." The words stung, but Matthews couldn't argue. He had damaged that trust long before the shooting. As the conversation ended, Matthews sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand. He had always prided himself on doing things by the book, on following the rules. But the truth was, he had allowed his own biases and anger to cloud his judgment. And now, he was paying the price. Tanya, meanwhile, was continuing her recovery. She had no idea what Matthews was going through, nor did she care. Her focus was on her community, on the people who needed her. She had been underestimated for too long, and now, she was the one in control of her own narrative. As Matthews faced the consequences of his actions, Tanya moved forward, knowing that the path she was on would lead her to places she never thought possible. It was no longer just about the past. It was about the future, and she was determined to create a future where justice, respect, and equality were the norms, not the exceptions. The days grew colder as the investigation into Officer Greg Matthews continued. He had been put on administrative leave, and the pressure was mounting with every passing moment. The media was relentless, and every headline seemed to reinforce the growing distance between him and the career he had worked so hard to build. Matthews sat at home, his mind in a constant state of turmoil. He could feel the weight of the situation pulling him under. The truth was undeniable now. He had failed in ways he hadn't imagined. The integrity of his career was at stake, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Tanya Williams, despite the intense public attention surrounding her, had found a sense of peace. The trauma from the incident had been significant, but Tanya was no longer the woman who kept her head down and stayed silent. She had used her experience, her voice, to spark change. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about standing up, being heard, and making sure that others knew they didn't have to face injustice alone. She had become a beacon for others, reaching out to people in need and offering support, even when her own wounds hadn't fully healed. The calls kept coming, messages from people who had faced their own battles, their own moments of feeling powerless. Tanya didn't know how to fix everything, but she knew that being there for others made a difference. She had become a part of a movement, one that aimed to change how people saw power, authority, and equality. Matthews, on the other hand, was spiraling. The investigation had intensified, and now it was clear that he would face disciplinary action. His superiors had made it known that his actions were not just a personal failure. They had reflected poorly on the entire department. He had been part of a system that allowed unchecked power to prevail. His heart sank as he prepared for the inevitable. His career was over. The calls he had received in the past few days had all been about him losing his job. There was no escaping the reality of it. He had been one of the good guys, or at least he had thought he was. He had followed the rules, or so he had believed. But now, it was clear that the system he had trusted was broken. Tanya was starting to see that her journey wasn't just about reclaiming her voice. It was about creating lasting change, and that was going to take more than just words. She had been a symbol of resilience, but now she needed to be a part of something bigger. She began to connect with others in her community, organizing, speaking out, and standing up for the rights of people who had been marginalized and overlooked. It was exhausting, and there were days when she wondered if the world would ever truly change. But every time she saw the strength in others, the way they came together, she felt renewed. Matthews, in contrast, was alone in his thoughts. His guilt, his shame, weighed heavily on him. He had no one to turn to, no one who understood what he was going through. The pressure was unbearable, and he had come to a realization. His life had changed forever, and there was no going back. The sense of control he had once had was gone, replaced by a stark awareness of his own vulnerability. He had hurt someone. He had let the system of power corrupt him, and now it was all falling apart. Tanya had found her purpose, even amidst the chaos. Matthews had lost his. As Tanya stepped forward into her new role as a voice for change, Matthews sat in the silence of his own remorse, knowing that he would have to answer for what he had done. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew it would be the hardest thing he had ever faced. The weight of the past few weeks hung heavily over Officer Greg Matthews as he sat in the small office of his lawyer. The world outside had continued moving, but inside this room, time seemed to stand still. The investigation into his actions was nearing its final stages, and it felt like the walls were closing in around him. His career, his identity, everything he had built seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The sense of guilt was undeniable, a constant companion that refused to be ignored. Every moment, every thought, seemed to lead back to the same place. The moment he raised his weapon, the moment his actions changed not just his life, but the life of Tanya Williams and countless others. Tanya, on the other hand, was finding a new sense of strength. She had stepped away from the hospital and into a world that was watching her every move. The messages, the calls, they were overwhelming. But she wasn't afraid. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, and now she was more visible than ever. The press conferences, the interviews, it all felt like a dream. But with every word she spoke, Tanya realized how much of her journey was about more than just herself. It was about every person who had ever felt overlooked, every person who had been treated as less than. She had become a symbol, but more importantly, she had become a voice. The kind of voice that demanded to be heard. She wasn't alone in her fight. As the investigation into Matthews continued, Tanya took it upon herself to turn the attention on the broader issues of police accountability and justice reform. She met with activists, spoke at rallies, and began to advocate for real change in the system. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she was no longer the quiet woman who kept to herself. Matthews' world, however, was unraveling. The disciplinary hearings had started, and he was being questioned, not only about the incident, but about his entire career. It was clear that this was not just a personal issue. It was about the system, the patterns of abuse, and the failure of those in power to hold themselves accountable. As he sat through the hearings, Matthews realized just how much he had taken for granted. He had never considered the power dynamics at play, the way his actions, his biases, had shaped his interactions with people like Tanya. He had thought he was justified. He had thought he was doing the right thing. But now, as the weight of the investigation bore down on him, he understood that his sense of justice had been warped by his own privilege. The process was long, and the uncertainty of what would happen next loomed over Matthews like a dark cloud. His world had crumbled, and there was no way to rebuild it without facing the consequences of his choices. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive himself, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget what had happened. Tanya had not only fought for herself, but for everyone who had been pushed aside by a system that favored the powerful. Matthews knew that no matter what happened, his life would never be the same. He had to live with the truth of what he had done, just as Tanya would live with the changes she had made in the world. Both their futures, so different, were now intertwined, shaped by one moment that had turned their lives upside down. Officer Greg Matthews sat in his lawyer's office, his mind racing as the final stages of the investigation were drawing to a close. It had been weeks since the incident with Tanya Williams, but it felt like a lifetime. His career, his reputation, everything he had once taken for granted was now at stake. He had tried to make sense of his actions, to understand how he had gone from being a law-abiding officer to the man sitting here today, facing the very consequences he had never imagined. Tanya, on the other hand, was standing stronger than ever. The media attention had only grown, and though she had once feared the spotlight, now she was using it to drive her mission forward. She had become a voice for change, pushing for reforms, meeting with lawmakers, and organizing community efforts. The pain of what had happened to her still lingered, but she had transformed it into something powerful, something that was beginning to inspire others. Tanya's newfound role came with its own set of challenges, though. She wasn't just advocating for herself anymore. She was standing up for people who, like her, had been overlooked and oppressed for far too long. The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on her, but she knew this was the path she was meant to walk. The more she spoke, the more people reached out to her. People who had their own stories of injustice, their own struggles with systems that failed them. Tanya became a symbol not just of survival, but of triumph over a system that had long favored the powerful. Meanwhile, Matthews found himself in an endless cycle of self-reflection and guilt. His life, once filled with certainty, had become an endless stream of interviews and meetings with investigators. His world had been turned upside down, and no matter how hard he tried to escape the harsh reality of what had happened, he couldn't. The investigation had uncovered a history of complaints against him, small actions, small biases that, in hindsight, had been leading him down this path all along. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules, who upheld the law. But now, faced with the truth of his actions, he understood how far he had fallen short. The investigation had revealed much more than the night of the traffic stop. It had uncovered a deeper issue within the department, one that stretched beyond his own personal mistakes. The system itself was flawed, and Matthews had become a symbol of that flaw. In his heart, he knew that no matter the outcome of the investigation, things would never go back to the way they were. He had become part of something larger, a part of a movement that was forcing the world to reckon with the realities of power, privilege, and the systems that upheld them. Tanya, as much as she had been a victim, was now a leader, one who was pushing for change, for accountability, and for justice. As Matthews faced the consequences of his actions, he couldn't help but wonder if he could ever truly make things right. He had been given a chance to reflect, to acknowledge the wrongs he had committed. But as the days wore on, it became clear that redemption, if it was even possible, would come at a steep price. Tanya's fight had become a beacon of hope for many. Matthews could see that now. He had once been part of a system that he thought was just. But now he saw it for what it truly was, a system that needed to change. As the investigation came to an end, Matthews knew that his life, his career, would never be the same. Tanya, on the other hand, was just beginning. The future was uncertain for both of them, but one thing was clear: they had both been part of something that would shape the world for years to come. The aftermath of the investigation had left its marks on both Greg Matthews and Tanya Williams, though in vastly different ways. Matthews, now fully aware of the consequences of his actions, sat at home, the silence of his apartment louder than ever. He had lost his job, his reputation, and most of the respect he once held from his peers. The news had been relentless, and the social media outrage was impossible to escape. He had become a symbol of what was wrong in law enforcement, a man whose actions, driven by unconscious bias, had hurt an innocent person. Tanya, in contrast, was experiencing a quiet kind of peace. It was a peace that didn't come from a lack of struggle, but from knowing that she had fought, stood up, and had been heard. She had become the voice for countless others who had faced similar experiences of injustice. And while her journey was far from over, she had already changed the course of her life. She had used the media attention not to elevate herself, but to shed light on the real issues, the systemic inequality, the biases, and the deep-rooted issues within institutions that were supposed to protect people. Her focus wasn't on the past or the damage done to her. It was on the future. Tanya's work was now her purpose. She met with leaders in her community, spoke at conferences, and participated in discussions on how to make lasting changes. The fight was just beginning, but Tanya had come to understand that change didn't happen overnight. It took time, persistence, and a collective effort. Meanwhile, Matthews was left grappling with his own feelings of guilt. He tried to stay out of the public eye, not because he was ashamed, though he was, but because he had no idea how to face the world he had once served. The department had let him go, but even then, the repercussions were far-reaching. The community no longer trusted him, and worse, he no longer trusted himself. He had been given the opportunity to reflect, and he had done so for days on end. He had seen the ugly truth of how his own biases had affected his judgment, and though it pained him to admit it, he knew he could never undo the harm he had caused. His life was now a constant reminder of the cost of that single moment of failure. Tanya, however, had found a way to turn her pain into strength. She didn't want revenge. What she wanted was justice, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that others wouldn't suffer as she had. Matthews, still recovering from his fall from grace, watched as Tanya's life flourished. He couldn't deny that she had done what he could never bring himself to do. She had taken responsibility for her story and used it to build a better future for herself and for others. Every step she took felt like a victory, and as Matthews thought about his own path, he realized how far he had yet to go. He had not only lost his career, but had lost a part of himself in the process. And Tanya? She was just beginning to rebuild the world around her, one step at a time. The future, as uncertain as it was, now belonged to those who were willing to face their pasts, make amends, and work together to create something better. Tanya had started the journey, and Matthews was left wondering if he could ever find the courage to join her. Months had passed since Officer Greg Matthews lost his job, and the weight of his choices continued to haunt him. He had faded from the public eye, his face no longer on the news, but the effects of his actions were still very much a part of his daily life. The isolation he felt grew deeper with each passing day. The simple act of stepping out of his apartment now felt like a daunting task. People would stare, avoid eye contact, or whisper as he walked by. He had been someone who once wore his uniform with pride, believing he was part of something bigger, a protector of his community. Now, that same community wanted nothing to do with him. Matthews had always seen himself as a man of integrity, someone who followed the rules, someone who was supposed to protect. But the events that had unfolded had shattered that illusion. He had let his biases take over, and in doing so, he had hurt someone who had trusted the system to protect her. Tanya Williams had not only survived the encounter, but she had also emerged stronger than he ever could have imagined. Her name had become synonymous with justice and change, a beacon for those who had been oppressed. She had taken the pain from that night and turned it into something greater, something the world could not ignore. Tanya had become the face of a movement, working tirelessly to expose the injustices in the system, fighting for those who had been wronged, and pushing for real reform. Every interview she gave, every rally she spoke at, only further cemented her role as a leader. She had turned the spotlight that once felt like a curse into a powerful tool for change. Tanya had become a voice for the voiceless, but it wasn't without cost. The emotional toll of reliving her trauma, the constant pressure of being a symbol for so many, weighed heavily on her. There were nights when the exhaustion would hit her all at once, when the weight of her mission would feel too heavy to bear. But she refused to give up. For every person who thanked her for her work, for every story of injustice that echoed her own, Tanya found the strength to keep going. She knew her work was far from over, and though the path ahead was uncertain, she was determined to keep moving forward. Matthews, however, could not say the same. He had tried to move on, to find another job, another way to live. But the guilt never left him. He had been given a chance to reflect, to change, but he had never felt further from redemption. He knew the truth, that his actions had forever changed someone's life, and no amount of self-reflection or remorse could undo the damage. Tanya had moved on. She had found a new purpose in life, and she was using her voice to create a future where justice, equality, and accountability were the foundation, not the exception. Matthews, on the other hand, found himself stuck in the past, unable to escape the weight of what he had done. His redemption, if it ever came, would not be easy. But for now, it was clear that he had to live with the consequences of his choices. Tanya had found her strength, her purpose, and she had become a leader. Matthews had lost everything, and in the process, he had learned the hard way that no amount of power, no badge, no uniform, could shield him from the reality of his actions. The world had moved on without him, and now, all that was left was the difficult task of coming to terms with the man he had become. The days continued to pass, and Officer Greg Matthews found himself isolated in a way he had never imagined. The weight of his past actions clung to him, a constant reminder that the life he had known was gone. His job, his career, his sense of pride, everything was lost. The world he had once been so certain of had shattered, and he was left in a place where nothing felt real anymore. No matter how many times he tried to move forward, he felt the suffocating presence of guilt and regret. Tanya Williams, on the other hand, was growing stronger with each passing day. The attention she had received after the incident had turned into something far greater than she had expected. What once seemed like a curse, being thrust into the public eye, had become a platform for her to bring attention to the issues that mattered. She had become a symbol of resilience, but more importantly, a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced. Tanya knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She had seen the struggles, the pain, the hardships that others had endured, and she understood that her journey was far from over. But with each step she took, each person she reached, Tanya realized that she was part of something bigger than herself. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for the countless others who had been overlooked, mistreated, and ignored. The work she was doing had begun to inspire change in ways she hadn't anticipated. Matthews, however, was still trying to come to terms with the man he had become. He had taken the time to reflect, to sit with his mistakes, and though he had learned a great deal, he found himself trapped by the past. His guilt lingered, eating away at him, and the recognition of how he had failed Tanya, and so many others, was impossible to escape. He knew that the system he had once believed in was flawed, that it allowed people like him to exist without consequence. And now, as he sat in the silence of his own apartment, he realized how much damage had been done, not just to Tanya, but to the entire community that had once trusted him. Tanya, meanwhile, had found her voice, and with it, a new purpose. She had met with politicians, activists, and community leaders, pushing for changes to the system that had failed her and so many others. She wasn't waiting for someone else to make the change, she was creating it herself. The more she spoke, the more she realized that her voice was powerful, and it was something she would continue to use to fight for justice. It wasn't about her past anymore, it was about the future. Matthews, still reeling from the weight of his own choices, began to wonder if he could ever find a way back. He had lost everything that had once defined him, and now he was faced with the reality of starting over. But starting over was a daunting task. He had spent his entire career believing that he was doing the right thing, following the rules, keeping people safe. But now, he saw how deeply his own biases had affected his actions, how he had failed to see the truth. And that truth was that he had become part of the very system he had sworn to protect. Tanya, however, wasn't waiting for redemption. She wasn't concerned with the man who had wronged her. She was focused on what she could do to make sure the future was different. And with every step she took, she could see the impact she was having. She wasn't just changing her own life. She was changing the lives of others, one step at a time. Matthews, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of his actions, unsure of what would come next. His future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he could no longer be the man he once was. Tanya had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had started to build a future where justice, equality, and accountability were the foundation, not the exception. Matthews could only wonder if he would ever find a way to be a part of that future. Months passed, and the lives of both Greg Matthews and Tanya Williams continued to unfold in ways neither of them had expected. Matthews had left the world of law enforcement behind, unable to escape the consequences of his past actions. The isolation he felt was overwhelming. The guilt, the shame, they consumed him. No matter how many times he tried to tell himself he could move forward, he found that the weight of his decisions was something he could never outrun. Tanya, on the other hand, had found peace in a way that Matthews could only envy. While the journey had been difficult, she had discovered strength she never knew she had. She had become a leader, using her platform to advocate for justice, not just for herself, but for countless others who had been silenced. Her work wasn't over, but with every step she took, she knew she was making a difference. She had become the voice of the voiceless, and with that responsibility came both honor and exhaustion. She had met with lawmakers, participated in protests, and continued to push for the changes she had always dreamed of. She wasn't just fighting for reform. She was fighting for a world where people like her would never again be treated as less than. Matthews, though, remained in a place of uncertainty. He hadn't expected his life to spiral this way. He had been a man of power, someone who believed in the rules. But those rules, as he now saw, had failed him. They had failed Tanya, and they had failed the people who had trusted him. As he tried to rebuild his life, Matthews was confronted with the painful reality that no amount of apology or self-reflection would ever truly make things right. His past actions had left a permanent mark on both his life and Tanya's. Tanya, despite all that she had endured, wasn't concerned with Matthew's redemption. She wasn't looking for an apology or closure from him. What mattered to her was the change she could create, the lives she could touch, and the hope she could give others. She had found peace not by holding on to the past, but by moving forward, creating a future where equality and justice were the guiding principles. She had learned that it wasn't about erasing the pain, but using it to fuel a journey towards something greater. Matthews, meanwhile, had no choice but to reckon with the truth of his actions. He understood now, in a way he never had before, the depth of the damage he had caused. And though he had no answers, no clear path ahead, he knew that his life could never be the same. He had become a part of a much larger movement, one that had exposed the cracks in the system he had once believed in. And Tanya? She had become a part of something much bigger too, a force of change, a force for good. She had shown the world that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. Matthews may have lost his career, but Tanya had gained her voice, and that voice was more powerful than anything Matthews had ever known. As both of their journeys continued, one was marked by regret, and the other by hope, but the truth was undeniable. They were both now a part of a story much bigger than themselves.